Diane Keaton is gone, 79 years old. California. Quietly, gracefully, just as she had lived the later part of her life. No big farewell, no spectacle. Just a silence that suddenly felt too heavy for Hollywood. That morning, timelines filled with her face Annie Hall, the Godfather, that effortless grin that made every scene feel alive. Every photo in black and white as if color would have been too loud for the loss. The New York Times called her a symbol of intelligence, grace, and independence. Vanity Fair wrote simply, she was not just an actress. She was the attitude of a generation. But what most people didn't expect was what followed. A voice that had stayed quiet for 40 years finally broke its silence. Al Pacino, her co-star, her friend, her almost love story. "You're a great artist," he wrote. "I remember it, and I love it, and I love you forever." Simple words. Raw, imperfect, trembling with everything that had never been said out loud. Behind the glow of the Godfather, behind the whispers of fame and awards, there had always been something else between them. Something real. Something the cameras could never quite capture. Al had once said, "We found a tempo and a temperature that was right." And maybe that was what they were, two people whose rhythm fit only when the world around them stopped spinning. When news of Diane's passing broke, Al's message hit differently. It wasn't nostalgia anymore. It was grief, finally given a voice. He wrote, "She helped me through my ruins when I could barely stand." And everyone reading it could feel that it wasn't about Hollywood anymore. It was about love, regret, and time, the kind that no award ever immortalizes. A close friend of Diane told people, "She lived truthfully, holding nothing back." I think Al understood that better than anyone. Maybe that's why their story never needed to end with a wedding or a breakup. It wasn't built on what people could see. It was built on what they felt. Diane once said, "I was never interested in being perfect. I just wanted to be honest." And that's exactly what made her different. While the rest of the industry chased perfection, she stood there imperfect, unfiltered, and endlessly real. Even in her 70s, she was still showing up, still laughing, still fearless. Her final film, Book Club: The Next Chapter, was released in 2023. She'd said it would be her last. No dramatics. Just another honest chapter closed. Meanwhile, Al, now 85, appeared only rarely. His health had faded, but when someone asked him about Diane a few months before her death, he said softly, "She was special. I don't think anyone could replace her." That was his last public word about her. And then, as if pulled by the same invisible thread that had connected them for half a century, people started tracing their story backward to where it all began. It was East Harlem, a small Italian restaurant called Patsy's, the early 1970s. The Godfather was just an idea on Francis Ford Coppola's desk. He saw something in Al, a quiet danger, a kind of stillness that scared people because it was real. The studio hated it. They said he was too short, too unknown. But Coppola refused to back down. For Kay Adams, he chose Diane Keaton, a stage actress barely out of her 20s, with a face that didn't belong in a mafia film. "She'll soften the darkness," Coppola wrote. She had no idea that her audition would change everything. She later recalled, "I remember meeting Al for the first time. It was awkward. He barely spoke. There was smoke everywhere, but I couldn't look away." That silence, the thing that might have driven anyone else crazy, was exactly what drew her in. Coppola said later, "Her audition was a performance I couldn't refuse." And that's how it began, a story that no one meant to write, but everyone still remembers. On set, Al barely talked to anyone. Diane, full of laughter, became the bridge between him and the rest of the world. One crew member said, "She made Al smile for the first time in weeks." And somehow, between long takes and late nights, the chemistry that made The Godfather so unforgettable wasn't just acting, it was them. When the film premiered, everything changed. The world discovered a new kind of love story, one where you could feel the emotion even when nothing was said. A critic wrote, "They bring such authenticity that you forget they're only characters." After the premiere, Al asked her to dinner. No fancy place, just a small restaurant near Central Park. That was when they really talked for the first time. Diane said, "He wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. He didn't try to be charming. He was just different." The film made them stars, but it also made them something else. Two people forever tied to a love story that would never truly fade, even as decades passed. And when the world lost Diane Keaton, it wasn't just mourning an actress. It was mourning the last half of a story that had lived quietly behind Hollywood's curtain. Because maybe the real tragedy isn't that Diane's gone. It's that somewhere an old man still whispers her name in the dark, remembering not the actress, but the woman who once made him smile in the middle of a set filled with silence. When The Godfather ended, they both walked off the set into something neither of them was fully prepared for: fame, so bright it could burn, and an invisible thread between them that no one else could see. Diane and Al were suddenly everywhere on magazine covers, in critics' praises, in whispers about their chemistry that didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. But behind that golden light was something more fragile. Success had lifted them high, but it also carried a quiet loneliness, the kind that fame never talks about. They started seeing each other outside of work dinners, premieres, quiet moments in corners of crowded rooms. They never flaunted it. They didn't need to. The connection was there in every glance, every silence that lingered longer than it should have. Diane once said, almost like she was confessing to herself, "Love of my life, but we're complicated." That was them, all sunlight and laughter. He, all shadows and thought. By the time The Godfather Part 2 hit the world, their romance had quietly become real. They were the couple everyone wondered about, but no one really knew. They moved like two different songs that somehow shared the same rhythm. Then came Annie Hall, 1977. Diane walked into history and didn't even realize it. The movie exploded with her voice, her clothes, her honesty. Everything about her felt alive and unscripted. When she won the Oscar for Best Actress, it wasn't just an award. It was a moment when Hollywood realized that being genuine could be revolutionary. She became the face of a new kind of woman, clever, flawed, free. And in every interview, she spoke with this fearless ease, like she was letting everyone in on a secret, that you didn't have to play by the rules to matter. Meanwhile, Al was carving out his own legend. Dog Day Afternoon, Scarface roles that made him the emblem of intensity, of rebellion, of a man who lived entirely on the edge of emotion. A critic once wrote that he was the face of America's post-war confusion, lost, proud, defiant. And maybe that was true. Al wasn't acting. He was living his characters from the inside out. He once said, "Diane and I have a rhythm that's ours." Maybe that's what kept pulling them back together. Something unspoken, an understanding that only artists who live too deeply can share. Friends said they could sit for hours just talking about the smallest things, films, theater, what made people tick. There was never noise between them, only a kind of quiet magic. But fame changes people in opposite ways. Diane embraced it, laughed with it, spoke to every camera like it was a friend. Al withdrew, retreating into silence, into the solitude that fame rarely forgives. And slowly their paths started to split, not because of anger, but because life had different plans for both of them. She dove into independent projects, restless and curious. He buried himself in studio films, intense and precise. They met again when Diane starred in Reds with Warren Beatty, and the tabloids, as always, tried to turn it into a story about jealousy. Diane brushed it off with her usual grace. "We're still friends. We don't need to define it." By the late 80s, the world had changed around them. Diane was in Los Angeles, exploring theater, even directing. Al stayed in New York, haunting Broadway stages, rarely seen in public. And though they still crossed paths at award shows, after parties, quiet hellos backstage, something had settled between them. Not distance exactly, but acceptance. They had loved, they had tried, and in the end, they had let each other go without bitterness. What remained was a thread that never broke thin, invisible but real. A quiet respect, a knowing. They didn't lose each other due to lack of love. They just got swept up in the current of two different lives. Time has a way of folding in on itself. Years pass, faces age, but certain connections never fade. Diane and Al were like two planets sharing the same orbit, always near, always aware of each other, but never quite colliding again. And then, out of nowhere, fate decided their paths would cross one last time. Francis Ford Coppola announced The Godfather Part 3. He wanted to bring everyone back, to close the circle that began 2 decades before. Both Diane Keaton and Al Pacino agreed, even though their love story had long since unraveled. It wasn't nostalgia, it was unfinished business. Filming began in Rome in 1989. The air on set was heavy with memory. Diane was warm and gracious, smiling easily with the crew. Al, quiet as ever, moved through the scenes like a man carrying ghosts. They spoke little off camera, but when the director called action, something clicked. The years melted away. You could feel it not just between Michael and Kay, but between Diane and Al. Two souls who had lived a version of those same heartbreaks in real life. Diane later said, "It was a reunion, but complicated." She didn't have to explain. By then, Al had a child with another woman, news that had wounded her deeply. They had stayed in touch, but that closeness had cooled. Al once admitted, almost under his breath, it was a goodbye that mirrored our characters. In her memoir, Diane wrote it more plainly. "I told him if he didn't want to marry me, I was leaving and I did. It wasn't a drama. It was years of waiting for an answer that never came." That was how their story quietly closed, a love stretched across decades, undone not by anger, but by timing. Coppola once said that during the final scene between Michael and Kay, the entire set went silent. No one dared to breathe. They didn't need to act, he said. They just had to look at each other. And in that look, every unspoken word of 20 years passed between them. When filming wrapped, Diane and Al said goodbye again, but this time it was for real. Diane turned toward peace. She adopted 2 children, Dexter in 1996, Duke in 2001, and built the kind of family she'd always dreamed of. She often said, "Motherhood taught me what love really means." Not as a replacement for what she lost, but as a new way to fill her world. Her career evolved with her. In Marvin's Room, she gave one of her most haunting performances, earning another Oscar nomination. Something's Gotta Give brought her back to the spotlight as a woman unafraid of age or vulnerability. Then came The Family Stone, Because I Said So book club roles that let her laugh, stumble, and shine as herself. Critics loved that she never chased fame. She grew with it, graceful, grounded, real. Al entered the 1990s on a different note. Scent of a Woman finally earned him his long-deserved Oscar. Heat, The Insider, The Devil's Advocate, each role a different reflection of his restless intensity. But behind the triumphs, he lived quietly. 3 children. Many loves. No marriage. He once said, "Marriage is a state I never entered, but I have known love." The line followed him everywhere, a confession and a defense, all at once. A man who had everything except permanence. Then, in 2024, Al published his memoir, Sonny Boy. It wasn't a celebrity tell-all, it was raw, unguarded, almost painfully honest. He wrote about growing up poor in the Bronx, about early fame, about how success sometimes felt like losing yourself in slow motion. And in the middle of it, he wrote about Diane. "She helped me through my ruins," he wrote. "After the revolution failed, I was lost. Diane pushed me toward the sea of love. She saved me." Few people knew that story until Sonny Boy. In another passage, he confessed, "We got drunk together after the Godfather shoots, and I knew then I'd never meet anyone like her again." It wasn't nostalgia. It was a memory carved deep enough to survive time. When Sonny Boy came out, critics called it the most human thing he'd ever done. They said the chapters about Diane were the soul of the book, the moment where the man behind the myth finally spoke. It felt like a love letter written decades too late. That same year, Diane received her Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Film Institute. Al was there, front row. When she walked onto the stage, he stood and applauded, eyes wet, hands trembling. Later, a reporter asked him what she meant to him. He said softly, "She changed the way I see love." After that night, they were never seen together again. A year later, Diane Keaton passed away peacefully in California. And when the tributes began, Al's Sonny Boy resurfaced everywhere. The pages about Diane spread across social media, read aloud by fans who'd never met them but somehow felt them. It was, in its own way, his final goodbye, the one he never said in person. Together, Diane and Al left behind more than movies. They left behind truth, the kind that lives quietly in the hearts of those who watch them, generation after generation. Diane redefined what it meant to be a woman on screen. Strong yet vulnerable, funny yet profound, never perfect but always honest. Her style, her voice, her fearlessness, they became more than art. They became free and Al. Al showed the world that power doesn't live in words or fame. It lives in silence, in the eyes, in the ache of what's left unsaid. Their story was never about forever. It was about something rarer than possession. Love without definition. A gaze across time that still flickers like a candle long after the credits have rolled. And maybe that's why, even now, when you rewatch that final moment, Michael, looking at Kay one last time, it doesn't feel like acting. It feels like the truth. If this story made you pause, if it made you think differently about love, time, or the people we never stop carrying, leave a comment below. And if you want to keep exploring stories that live between the scenes, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Some stories never really end. They just fade, softly like light on film.